All right, well, thanks very much. There are a few people still making their way in from coffee, but that's fine. Find a seat. There's loads of room, lots of opportunity. First things first, holy cow, look at this monster. I sat here like yesterday watching the talks and just thinking, this is a lot of screen. This is a lot of screen to play with, and it's really tempting when you finally get a chance to plug into a screen like this, maybe just to show your holiday snaps. That would be terrible, but look at those. That's nice. But I won't do that, because although it's kind of fun for me, it will soon kind of devolve into, not pictures of redwoods, but pictures of bacon, or pictures of goats, or pictures of goats biting me, or, it's not really what you're here for. It's not a good use of your time. But I want to find a way to use the screen somehow. So, I don't know, maybe I'll do something else. Maybe I will just put up all of the slides in one go, and you can just work through at your own pace. We've got 50 minutes. If you're lost, we're up here, slide 5. Which is the picture of all the slides. It gets meta quite quickly. I couldn't keep that up. But no, let's not do it that way. Let's try and stick together, because I want to kind of call this thing out. You've very kindly come to this session about JAMstack, but what on earth? We've got stacks. There are lots of stacks around. There's the LAMP stack. There's the MAMP stack. There's the XAMPP stack. Mean stack. Ruby on Rails, that doesn't seem to conform to the other conventions. I don't know, there's lots and lots of stacks around. So why do we need another one, and what's it all about? Well, JAMstack stands for JavaScript, APIs, and markup. But that in itself isn't much use as a definition of what it is. What does that really even mean? Well, that's what I want to try and talk to you about today. I want to kind of work through this. I'm hoping that we'll be able to find like a better definition and kind of go beyond a definition and get some understanding of what JAMstack is. I want to talk a little bit about the impact and some of the opportunities of building on this stack and this kind of architecture. Along the way, I'm hoping that I'll call out some tools, some services that can be useful. And we'll also look at a couple of examples and talk about some of the results. But one of the things that comes up time and time again when I talk about the JAMstack is people ask me, well, isn't this just a fancy new name for static sites? And that's kind of reasonable, because that's part of it. Part of the JAMstack is serving things as static assets, and I want to address that and go beyond that. So that's the plan for the next 47 minutes. My name's Phil Hawksworth. I work in developer experience at a company called Netlify. I'm hoping we'll be able to get through this in time for some Q&A at the end, and I know that there might be some Q&A coming in from the live stream. If we don't manage to get to some of those, or we don't get to your questions, you can always send me a question on Twitter, or even better, come and grab me here, come and speak to me. Very keen to talk to you. But otherwise, you can pepper me with questions on Twitter at Phil Hawksworth. That's me. So this question that I arrived at and then ducked away from quite quickly. Let's get to that first of all. Isn't this just a name for static sites? Well, even before we talk about that, let's talk about a couple of definitions. And I want to talk about this word static, because static is a really loaded term. Yes, static is a big part of the JAMstack, but static has some odd connotations. People kind of think of it as something which is maybe not very cool or undesirable. And if we even look at it, in terms of the dictionary definition of this, what does it say? It says, static, lacking in movement, action, or change, especially in an undesirable or uninteresting way. Okay, well, I'm trying to hold your attention for 45 minutes, so already this doesn't sound like something that's going to be very enticing. But I would argue that this kind of reaction to static is really a reaction to the feeling of the experience we might get. Are we really talking about an experience of a static site which doesn't do anything? Or are we talking about static as an architecture? And I'm talking about static as an architecture when I talk about a static site or a JAMstack site. I want to try and convince you that being able to host something statically is a real virtue. It's a huge benefit to do that. And as a way to illustrate that, I just want to look at a very high-level example comparing something that might be served statically versus something that might be served dynamically. And this is a bit of an oversimplification, but hopefully it illustrates the point nonetheless. So if we look first of all at the journey of a request for something which is served dynamically, we're starting in the browser. and our user makes a request to see some page in the browser. And maybe that request hits a CDN, but more likely it's actually going to pass through that and go directly to maybe a load balancer, which will do some logic and figure out which of the web servers behind the load balancer needs to service this request, which one has capacity. And then those web servers will have some logic. They might be running, a web server of their own. They might be running PHP. They might be running all kinds of things. They need to assemble a view of that of that page. They might need to go and get some data for that, which might live in one of a number of databases, or maybe on different servers. And then that data is going to come back from the database server. It's going to get assembled into a view in the web server that's get returned back through the load balancer, back possibly to CDN. Some items might get cached there, and then ultimately we get a view back into the browser and into the eyeballs of the user. So along this journey, there's lots of clever stuff. There's lots of infrastructure. There's lots of code. There's lots of logic. So there's lots of failure points. On a static site, the scenario is a little bit different. So here, same deal. We make a request for a view. That goes to a CDN, which has the pre-rendered view of that site, and it returns it to the user. And we're done, potentially. So straight away, you can see where maybe an angle I'm coming at this is that, well, simplicity is a wonderful thing. Getting code out of the request path is a beautiful thing. And there are lots of opportunities that we can take advantage of, and I'll get into those in a second when we go for this kind of model. So there's lots of advantages here. So I really want to try and persuade you that static isn't something that's dull. Static actually means it's something that's capable of being served directly from a CDN. Anyone who's managed sites in the past and has tried to optimize performance by putting a CDN in front of your servers might know that that can be a challenging thing. Figuring out what gets cached in the CDN and when is a bit tricky. So if it's static, it can entirely be served from a CDN. And static means that there's an opportunity to reduce this kind of complexity, and I'm all about that, not just because I'm lazy. So I'm convinced that static is a virtue. So those reasonable voices again. Isn't JAMstack just a fancy new name for static sites? Well, yes and no. Let's talk a little bit about stacks themselves. Let's do a little comparison. What are we talking about? What are these definitions? Let's take the LAMP stack. I'm imagining that quite a few people in the room may have built something on the LAMP stack before. Can I have a little show of hands? Like, whoa, most of you. Okay, tons of you. So you're kind of familiar with this, in no particular order. We've got Apache as part of that, which of course is doing our HTTP routing and maybe serving some assets directly. We've got PHP, which I've never really understood why it's a pre-hypertext processor. That's what it is. It's funny that there was the word pre in there because it's doing it typically at request time, but that's your kind of pre-processing. We've got maybe access to some data through MySQL, and that's sitting on top of an operating system being Linux. Wrapping this all up together, we've got our LAMP stack, kind of our web server. And as we saw in that previous illustration, often there are multiple of these if we're trying to, have resilience and worry about scale and all of those kind of things. So this is the kind of picture that we have here for the LAMP stack. If we compare that to the JAMstack, well, JAMstack is kind of moving a layer away from the operating system. It's actually moving away from the server. I talked about it being directly from a CDN. So really, we're starting to take as read that it's going to sit on top of a CDN, something that we don't need to manage. So it might be some kind of simple static server or indeed a CDN to give you some scale. But the JAMstack is really thinking about what happens in the browser. It's thinking about the markup that delivers content into the browser. It's thinking about JavaScript that can run in the browser. And in many ways, the runtime of the web now lives in the browser. We're able to do things directly in JavaScript in the browser. And so whereas before we were running that on the server, now it's kind of moving a little bit closer to the user. And then when it comes to accessing data, now we've got access to different APIs, different services that we might be able to pull data from directly from the client, also from the server at build time, but we'll talk about that in a second. So the JavaScript APIs and markup that we're talking about when we talk about the JAMstack doesn't live on the server. It's kind of moved a level closer to the user in this particular stack. So I think that JAMstack done well is pre-rendered. We pre-generate our site as much as humanly possible at build time, so there's less work to do in the browser. It can be served statically. And then, we can progressively enhance the experience with JavaScript and access to either browser APIs or external APIs at kind of runtime. So that's what I'm describing when I'm talking about the JAMstack. If we compare these a little bit, if we compare these two, again, you can see that the JAMstack has kind of moved the stack up a level closer to the user, is into the browser now. Now, of course, you probably recall, when you're building things for the LAMP stack, you're also outputting this stuff as well. So it's not like we're necessarily introducing something new here. In many ways, we're kind of shortening the stack, shortening the area that you need to focus on, which has a bunch of different benefits. And one of them that I'm super excited about is simplifying deployments. That doesn't sound very exciting. That doesn't sound very exotic for a Saturday morning. But simplifying deployments is huge because projects are complicated. Project complexity is a real headache. It's really difficult. We can sometimes think about how a project will run from start to finish and know that it's a journey that we can go on and have confidence in. But realistically, if we look at the perfect project timeline, from start to finish, which starts, of course, with the brief that we get for a project and ends wonderfully with the awards that we all receive, knowing titters in the room already. But it gets worse because, realistically, there is no perfect project timeline. That's folly. First of all, we haven't done any work yet, so I don't know why we think we deserve these awards. At some point, we're going to have to start to do some work. And before we get these awards, probably we should launch something. That seems reasonable. To figure out what we're going to launch, we probably need to have some exercise with the client where we figure out what the scope of this project is. And to make sure they're happy with what we've built, there's probably going to be some kind of sign-off towards the end, some final sign-off that we say, yes, you've delivered exactly what we said. Thank you very much. So before we can even get that sign-off, we'll have to have some kind of review with the client. So with these things, in place, our timeline is getting crunched a little bit. We've got less time to do things than we thought. So we kind of set ourselves about doing our work, designing things, building things, maybe deploying them so that we can start to see them. As we start to get a little bit closer to the client review time, that's when we rescope. Because now the client has seen what we're doing and they're like, oh, we wanted a different thing. So then there's a rescoping that often happens there. Now we've got very little time before the client review. So now things kind of pick up at a more feverish pace. We're working faster than we did before. We get to our client review and they want some different changes. We're not quite there. So then we can start really cranking up the pace. Maybe some of our processes and some of our systems starting to creak a little bit. We're cutting a few corners. Then when we start cutting a few corners and getting our deployments done as fast as we possibly can, that's when this happens. Don't know what that is, but we'll get back on track in just a moment. We're scrambling then, knowing that we need to get back in time for this final review, so the next one's going to be perfect. It's not perfect. Don't understand why that's there, why that's what it is, but that's the kind of thing that happens in scramble mode. The next things that we do are really at a feverish pace now, getting to final sign-off. We get there, we're delighted, we're ready to move forward to launch, except it's not final sign-off. There's a few comments because it's final sign-off. Then we can launch after we've made those few changes. We're ready for the awards once we've done a few post-launch changes to get the fixes done. It's a shit show, is what I'm saying. It's a difficult thing to get from brief to the awards via some kind of launch to get something out there. So deploying things is complicated. Deploying things is already tricky, but when it's feverish like this and there's unknowns that creep in, it's really difficult. When you get to launch day, you don't really want to be in this situation where it's like, okay, now's the moment of deploy. This is probably going to be fine. I stole this just wholesale from MailChimp. If anyone's done a big mail out to millions of people, that encapsulates it perfectly, and that's the button you actually press in MailChimp to launch your campaign. But for us, that's what it can feel like on deploy day if we haven't proven out our deploy process all the way along. We go back to our timeline, we can figure out that if we look at one of these deploys, there's a reason why things are unknown, because our deploys involve all kinds of things. There's lots of different infrastructure. Sometimes we're deploying things that are big monolithic apps that are very kind of tightly coupled across lots of different servers. So it's little wonder that trying to maintain a knowable state of our systems, deploying things in a predictable way, is challenging. Sometimes things creep in that we don't expect. So when we get to the point that we're going to launch something, it should feel kind of mundane. It shouldn't feel, I don't know, a little bit more like this, which is often what it's felt like to me when deploying a project. Oh, shit. I think the people videoing that were probably fine. I don't know of anyone being injured. I don't know. But yeah, exactly. So it's challenging whenever we're deploying things, but it's all the more challenging when we've got complicated infrastructure to deploy. When we're doing a launch where we have to touch all of these different bits of infrastructure, that raises the work, it raises the effort, it raises the unknowns. So I'm all about the simplicity and trying to get something to the CDN. I'm pummeling this point a lot because it's all for me about getting something served as quickly as possible. So the interesting things then start to creep in when it's a question of, well, how do we get things to the CDN as fast as possible? And we'll come on to that in just a moment. So is this something new? Actually, the JAMstack stuff is potentially nothing new because we've been talking about serving things statically, I guess, for a long time. Aaron Swartz talked about, he gave us this phrase, bake, don't fry, when he was looking at how he wanted to re-engineer his own blog, thinking about how content management systems work, and really not wanting to create a view every time someone came and made a request. He didn't want to fry things on demand. He wanted to bake things in advance. And he went on to kind of talk about this. He said, I care about not having to maintain cranky AOL servers, Postgres and Oracle installs. And he said this, back in 2002. This is not a new concept. But the things I think are changing are in how we get things to the CDN. The fact that CDNs are within our grasp now and we can have some workflows to help us get there, that for me is what's starting to make things kind of interesting. I happen to work for one of the companies that does that, but there are a bunch of others. I work at this place, Netlify, but there's a bunch of others that do similar things. So you may have come across Surge in the past, which allows you to just run a single command and get the build that you've had on your local machine out to their serving infrastructure quickly. We do something kind of similar. There's also Zeit who do something similar. Or you can go direct to the cloud providers that these companies sit on top of. You can do these kind of things with Azure, with AWS, with Google Cloud. There are lots of ways to do it. And the tooling is the things that are starting to get kind of interesting for me. So, if we're starting to look at this kind of decoupled architecture, this kind of simplified kind of static hosting, this is how a workflow might look. We're typically, as developers, building things on our local machine, first of all. We might run some kind of build. I'm all about static site generators because they help us build something locally that we can then see in our local a static server locally. Now that build might be doing things like pulling in content from local resources or external, applying those to templates, adding data, mixing those together, the kind of things that we were doing directly in the LAMP stack. We're doing this locally in a build step. We can preview those perfectly in a static server that's just kind of built into our machines. But then when it comes to deploying it, then we take that asset and we push it to some hosting provider, ideally somewhere that will push it to a CDN so it gets closer around the network to our users. That's all fine, but let's just talk a tiny bit about the impacts and the kind of opportunities there. First of these, this kind of model is security. We're kind of simplifying this hosting stack. We've got a greatly reduced surface area that can be attacked. We're not now hosting lots of moving parts around the infrastructure, so there are fewer moving parts to attack. At Netlify, we operate our own CDN, so we've got the advantage of being able to see what kind of traffic comes across it. And it's amazing to see what a huge proportion of requests that come to the domains that we serve are looking for a WP admin URL, just probing for attacks. None of them exist because all of the sites that we host are statically rendered and there is no such URL to attack. But this is a really common thing that's happening across the internet, people looking in automated ways for surfaces to attack. If we can get those moving parts out of what we serve, it means that some of those problems just simply go away. When we talk about things like performance and scale, it can feel a bit presumptuous to start talking about, well, the site we're building, we're going to need that to be at huge scale and perform really, really well. We never know how well things are going to do. But I've been involved in lots of projects where I had to start to plan for what if this thing gets popular? How do we price the hosting? How do we price the project? And you have to start predicting how many load balancers, how many web servers, and all of the rest of it might we need for the traffic we might anticipate. That kind of goes away if you're serving things from a CDN by default, because they're built specifically for that purpose, to kind of carry the load, work under performance and under stress. So these things are kind of nice, but the other real opportunity and benefit, I think, comes from developer experience. Now, I'm really cautious about saying the word developer experience because it feels like sometimes we think about what is a CDN is a question from the world. Thank you very much. A CDN is a content delivery network. So a content delivery network, I keep on alluding to, so thank you for calling me out, is something that lives at the network. It's the distributed network of servers that is primarily tasked with carrying a load around the network, being closer to where people are making their requests so that you can distribute the serving of assets. It's the kind of thing that lots of companies provide as a service, and it's often introduced as like an edge kind of caching layer closer to where the user sits. So that's a CDN. But when it comes to developer experience, as I mentioned, I'm kind of nervous about calling this out because it's sometimes seen as, well, let's just make it fun for the developer, easy for the developer, regardless of what the output is. And that's, of course, not what I mean. Developer experience is something that I think is really important because if we can reduce the friction for developers, make it easier to do certain things, that means that we can create a lot less friction in creating something that's wonderful for the user. So developer experience is something I think is always in service of good user experience. One aspect of a good developer experience comes from confidence. It comes from deployment confidence. I mentioned earlier on, that with this model we can deploy a lot more easily, a lot more readily, and some of that comes from having a static hosting infrastructure, which gives us things like immutable deployments and atomic deployments. What on earth do those mean? Well, thinking back to an environment I used to sometimes deploy in, I used to deploy by FTP. Has anyone in the room kind of deployed a site by FTP in the past? Oh, that's a lot of hands. We all have. We've all done it. Some of us may still be deploying by FTP, but this is the environment that I've sometimes seen by deploying by FTP. This is a scenario I encountered at an agency I worked at many moons ago, where we're deploying a big project to a production server, and so the way we would deploy that is we would stage something on our staging server, make sure it was okay, and then we would drag and drop things from one place to the other in an FTP window, which may or may not be similar to what you were doing, but either way, we were changing the state of the production server. We were mutating the state of that server by adding assets like one by one. That typically would also result in us moving things across, hitting refresh in the browser and going, nope, and then moving another thing and hoping for the best. And when that didn't work out, then we'd be moving that directly from the developer's environment across to production. Honestly, anyone ever done this? There's a lot of honesty in this room. I was surprised that hands went up, but I admire your honesty. And then, after that doesn't necessarily work, then we start moving things from the other developer's environment. You'll notice that none of these environments are the same shape. None of them are the same as the production environment. So that staging environment, that was just kind of for fun. That's folly. But when we're talking about immutable deploys and atomic deploys, that's very different. Immutable is exactly that. It means that when we make a deployment, it doesn't mutate the state of the server. We're actually creating an entire valid deployment that we can live next to the previous deployment. It's atomic. It is completely contained. And also, it's atomic with regards to when it goes live. So even though we know that the deployment has to transmit lots of files and lots of assets across, that deployment isn't complete and isn't starting to serve traffic until it's completely there, until every asset is there. So you never get into the instance of serving some assets from the previous version, some from the new version, because things are in transit. I want to kind of demonstrate that to you just a tiny bit, and this is where I'm going to nervously flick across to kind of actually doing things on my hotspot, because I'm not on the Wi-Fi. What could go wrong? It could be fine. Forgive me, because I am going to do this within Netlify, and I'm cautious about you thinking that I'm just trying to sell you Netlify, but it's the process that I'm trying to talk about rather than the tool. So let's give that a try. Where's my mouse? I'm going to unmirror. Does that say you're talking to me? Okay. Hopefully I won't have to do this over my shoulder. So I'm going to do this in the context of my own site because vanity. This is my site. It's a blog. You've seen blogs before. It's not massively exciting. I mean, it is massively exciting. You should go and look at it. That's what I should be saying. But this is hosted statically. It's hosted directly from a CDN. And every deployment I've ever made is, I don't have to toggle the screen size. This is amazing. Can you see that at the back? Oh, I love this screen. I'm getting one of these. You can see every deployment that's been done. There was one at 8:06 this morning, and it's going back through history. And since these are immutable, since I haven't been gradually morphing the state of the server, these live on in perpetuity. Again, they're static, so that we can do that. So every one of these has a URL that I can navigate to. Actually, I'm going to go to this URL, which is a unique URL that maybe you can't see quite so well. So each deployment has its own URL that lives on forever. And so I could navigate back through time and see any of my sites. That's the live one. What I'll do, what the heck, we'll go, let's do a bit of time travel. Let's go back as far as I can and as far as I dare to August the 21st, 2016. What was I talking about then? Let's have a look at it. So this is the site then. It looks a bit different. I'm still banging on about JAMstack. It never changes. I've been talking about this for a while. So this is the state of my site back then. It lives on. But since this is static, since this is already somewhere that I could just start serving it again, I can do that. Let's change it. Let's actually say, well, let's publish this deployment. Are you sure? Well, I don't know. I'm worried about all my millions of users, but I'll publish that. And what's happened now is that at the CDN level, if I just refresh that, now that is my live site. That's the published site that I have. I can go and navigate around that site because it's all just static assets that I've got served from a CDN. This is really liberating, knowing that you can at any point revert, maybe not 3 years, but back to a previous build is really liberating. The idea of that kind of shaky, sweaty finger of pressing the button to deploy, that kind of goes away a tiny bit when you know that at any stage you can revert back to a previous deployment. I kind of love that. I'm going to put it back because it's making me a little bit twitchy. So here we are on the live URL. Let me go back to, is this the beginning? Yeah, this is my first one. I'll go back here. Let's see how quick this is. Publish, deploy, publish, go back there, refresh. There we go. And so now I'm at that point in my blog again. It's back to the present day. So this, as I say, this is really powerful, really rapid, and really empowering for developers. The fact that we have that kind of security in knowing that a deployment isn't forever. A deployment isn't shit or bust. Hopefully this will work out. Hopefully I'll refresh it and things will be fine. And then we're in an unknown state and we have to figure things out from there. Let me go back to Keynote. And let me unmirror again. Okay, so where were we? So this is all fine, but so far I'm just kind of talking about things that are static, and I know you're still thinking about that static caravan and those kind of sites that never ever change. And something that can really help us here is with automation. I mentioned earlier on that the things that are exciting about this approach isn't that it's new, but it's some of the tooling around it to get things to the CDN are improving. You saw an example of one just then. When we start to bring in lots of automation to this as well, then we can make things much more easy to repeat, which again breeds confidence. We can have things that are predictable when we deploy them because they're scripted and they're automated. And things like accountability and agility all kind of improve when we can do that. So let's look at this example that we saw a bit earlier on about, we're doing a build locally and then we're taking those assets and getting them into a CDN. Really, we want to think about, well, that's fine, we're moving this build output to the CDN, but really we want to be able to do something in a much more kind of repeatable and knowable way. And that's where Git-based deployments come in. Now, I'm a nerd for a lot of things, but I'm a nerd for Git-based deployments because they bring version control all the way from your environment right the way through to production. And that's so key for confidence. So how do those work? Well, you may have come across this pattern before in other environments. But this is how it works. Our local build that we've been running, yes, it outputs something that we can serve statically. We're not going to put that asset direct to our hosting environment. What we're going to do is we're going to check it into Git, like good developers do. We're tracking our code. It lives in a Git repository. And it's that Git repository that our continuous integration server will follow. So in other words, we have a server that is watching the repository. Whenever there's a change there, we pull the code into a build environment, run that build, and then that outputs the same exact static site that we would have generated locally had we run the build locally. It's the same build, just running in 2 different places. Now, this is really nice because it means that our deployment now doesn't depend on us like dragging things around or pushing assets around via an API or something like that. Now our deployments are based on activities in Git. So when we're ready to deploy, we make a particular kind of a push in Git and a deployment can take place. This unlocks all kinds of things like we're pulling in different data sources. We can start to decouple these things so that now we've got data not just coming from our code base, but coming from some kind of decoupled environment elsewhere. Content APIs are just exploding on the web. There are lots of headless CMSs that are hosted as a service that you can use their administration to manage content and then pull the content out of that system using APIs to run into your build. There are things like pricing engines that you can use for content APIs. There are asset management tools. There are all kinds of things that we can use to pull into our code as we run it. So in this environment, when we run our build locally, we're kind of firing that trigger, pulling content in from these APIs and generating a site, and we can see how that looks. But then the nice thing is that in our hosting environment, the same thing can happen. So if a change happens in our code in Git, or if a change happens in our content API, that can trigger a build to run. And the build runs just the same as it did in your local environment. It pulls the content from the content APIs, it gets the latest code, it runs a deploy, and it publishes it. So this gives us a chance to deploy with really, really low friction. And that results in really high confidence. Now, I could show you various kind of complicated examples of that, but I'd rather show you a ridiculous example because there's a kind of a question about, well, how often can I run a deployment? How often is that reasonable to do? And if we're going to have automation and scripting and things like triggers to fire these events to run a deployment for us, we haven't got that sweaty, nervous finger anymore. Now we can automate things. We can do them regularly. And I was called out a while ago by Zach Leatherman, who said, here's a free side project idea, an HTML-only static site-generated clock, that deploys a new version every minute. And that's silly. That's a silly thing to do. But then, when Chris Coyer bundles in and said, that would be clever marketing for sure. Build so cheap you can set your clock by them. That starts to get interesting. So I thought about this for a while. And then I thought, what the heck? That's worth a go. And I thought about it, and I played around, and then I came to this conclusion, and I said, only an idiot would make the thing you're suggesting. Here it is. So if you wanted to go to setyourwatchbynetlify.com, or if you're too lazy to type that, you can find that at /time. If you were to go there, what you should find is a deployment that happened sometime within the last minute. I've been talking for 33 minutes. There should have been 33 deployments that happened while I was talking. And a deployment, all it does is it gets the server time and it creates a page with that server time. In fact, it creates more than one page. It creates a bunch because there are different time zones around the world. So you can go to the different pages. Each one has its own URL, and you should be routed through to the correct one with correct localized time. What is the time? Anyone have the time? Yeah, I was just expecting someone to have looked at it and answer. That's fine. I'm glad you don't know the time. But hopefully that was correct. Hopefully that had been deployed sometime within the last minute. And the reason that's possible to do is because of automation, but also because of things like triggers. So this is a wonderful service if you want to automate a build. If you're having a build that you can trigger, based on some kind of event, webtask.io is a service that will let you run serverless functions for free in their environment. And what I do is I have a webhook, which all it does is it fires my particular build environment. It says, please run a deploy. And I run that every minute of the day on webtask.io. This has run 341,661 times. I don't know what those 32 errors are. I don't know. Go figure. But there's a lot of deployments to have happened kind of unmonitored, just happened automatically on their own. And of course, that's ridiculous. Don't do that. It's not the way to deploy sites, to deploy them every minute. But what I want to illustrate is that there are lots of ways now that we can be confident enough to deploy a site regularly and in an automated fashion, so it shouldn't need to be a terrifying thing to do. And I think things like the JAMstack, static hosting, automation, that can help bring that into a reality. So let's look at a few examples and results of this kind of thing. Well, there's certain types of sites that just lend themselves very nicely to this. Things like documentation sites for React is a static site that's hosted statically directly from a CDN, as is the site for Vue and lots of other projects, open source projects. Citrix did a project to move from a large, expensive enterprise CMS and platform across to a statically hosted site for a big portion of their sites. And they saw incredible results when they did this. When they moved across from that, they talked about the pain that went into deploying changes and content updates, because they're a large organization and they had many hundreds of thousands of pages across different languages. And it used to be that the turnaround for updates used to be weeks to deploy something predictably. It was painful and difficult for them. And that went to minutes. You can look at a case study of this if you like. All the links to this in this presentation, by the way, will be shared at the end. They also talked about the cost implications when they made this change from big complex infrastructure to something statically hosted. They estimate their annual cost savings run the site properly is around 65% cost savings. Huge cost savings for them when we're talking about that kind of scale, or any scale indeed. So they went, let me skip ahead. So another one which is maybe not such an obvious example is Smashing Magazine. Is Vitaly in the room, or is he? Of course he's not. He's in the other talk, learning about fonts. That's fine. So Smashing Magazine is a slightly different type of site to the ones I've just mentioned, because there's so much more interactivity and there's so much more that you can do there. But Smashing Magazine used to be across a bunch of different platforms. It was heavily WordPress and then some other things to run things like the membership and the message boards and the job boards. And that was hard to do at that kind of scale. And Vitaly, you can talk to him about this, but he mentions, we had some caching issues, probably using every single WordPress caching plugin out there. There are a bunch of them, and sometimes you kind of drop them in and hope for the best. Sometimes you configure them. They can be complex, and people layer one on top of the other to try and make things go fast. But if you're serving things from a CDN, because everything's pre-rendered, it's fast by default. So through the project that Smashing did, they went from all of these different disparate platforms, from 5 different platforms down to 1. They're pre-generating, serving everything statically. And that had a profound impact for Smashing. Their time to loading content went from 800 milliseconds to 80 milliseconds. They had a 10x improvement in site speed and site performance. So the results of this can be really profound. But they don't have to just be for sites that are kind of reading sites, documentation sites or consuming sites like that. The JAMstack can support applications as well, of course, because you can do things in JavaScript as well if it's appropriate. The Google Chrome team launched this recently at Google I/O, which is like a Minesweeper clone. This is really painful. I recorded this of myself while sat in the conference, and I've realized how terrible I am at Minesweeper under pressure. It's really agony to watch. Come on, Philip. You can do better than this. That's clearly not a mine. Terrible. Yeah, disaster. It's painful to watch, but it's kind of interesting that this is a game developed with JavaScript, served entirely in the browser, because we can do that kind of thing. Sometimes it is appropriate to do that. This is served statically, directly from a CDN. There's nothing in the background that's a server that's running. There's no origin server. Heavily optimized, so the payload to interactive is just 25 kilobytes. The kind of tooling that we have now can really help to kind of slice up the payload, progressively load things. Static serving can really help with that as well. Time to interactive is under 5 seconds. That's on slow 3G. This is a really interesting project. I'd encourage you to check it out just to see how they put that together. And so this kind of brings me to talking about JavaScript a tiny bit, because there's a big J at the beginning of JAMstack. And so it's tempting to think that JAMstack means statically serving JavaScript sites that completely depend on JavaScript. But JAMstack sites don't have to depend on JavaScript at all. We don't need to be shipping this and a bundle of JavaScript for a JAMstack site to exist. I'm all for building things in JavaScript where it's appropriate, such as a game like we just saw. But for the most part, we don't need to do that all the time. Alex Russell talks about performance all the time and talks about the best way to gain better performance is to ship less JavaScript. And so JavaScript's wonderful. It's right there in the acronym for JAMstack. But it's a power responsibility thing. So for me, JAMstack is about pre-rendering as much as possible, generating things ahead of time in a build environment and removing the need for an origin server that we need to maintain, deploy to, update, secure, and all of those kind of things. It's a model that lets us progressively enhance when it's appropriate with JavaScript to either using APIs in the browser or APIs from external services. All of those things exist. So I want to talk a tiny bit about augmenting the JAMstack sites. Now, how can we do something where we actually do need a server? Because every now and again, you have to just have some logic running somewhere on a server, when with JAMstack, no such server exists. Well, that's where serverless can kind of come to the rescue. Every once in a while, if we need to just have some secret somewhere that we don't want to send down the wire, a serverless function can be the key. I'm nervous about even saying the word serverless because I know someone's going to mention that there's a server somewhere, which is fine. I think of serverless in the same way as I think of wireless. I have a wireless router in my house. It's got about 4 wires coming out of it. That's fine. But it's sometimes safer to just talk about functions as a service. I think that's a bit more descriptive. Functions as a service enable a bit of a microservices architecture. I'm not going to go deeply into that really, but I just want to say that this can really lower the head of deploying, maintaining, managing, and securing our code. Again, we're thinking about ways that we can deploy, we can deploy code into an environment that we don't ever need to manage, something that's kind of a burden that's shifted. And there are places that we can shift the burden to. AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, they all provide serverless function hosting for us. And they'll take care of things like the software and patches for the environment that they run in. The operating system is something that they'll take care of. We don't even need to care about what that is. Even the network layer, or even things like physical and virtual scaling, these are all abstracted away from us, which is kind of nice. So in this model, it means that we can start to build services that just have one job. They're very, very discrete. They're very, very targeted. And so when we just have services that just do one job, they can do those really, really well. And I know that just having a single job doesn't guarantee success. There are plenty of ways that we can mess that up. But it does mean that it's something that we can focus on a little bit more discreetly. When we start to build things with microservices and with serverless functions, we are kind of building this incredible glue layer that we can use with events and webhooks, like I showed with the automation before. All of these things provide like a glue that can help us build these services together. Type of services we're talking about, well, there's bought services, things that we might get expertise of other people, like content management systems. I mentioned those before. We can outsource that, use the services that people provide. People like Contentful, Sanity, Graph CMS. There's oodles of them. There are asset services like Cloudinary that will do asset optimization and serve those at the CDN level for us as well. We can make use of those. Things like e-commerce, there are vendors for those, even identity providers. There are all kinds of things we can do that we don't have to build ourselves anymore. We can use APIs to get access to these. All of these services have APIs that we can consume either at build time or at request time right from the browser. But you might think, well, that sounds risky. That's the kind of thing that we want to own. We want to own that problem, own that expertise. What about the risk? Well, I'm kind of a risk-averse kind of a person. In fact, the agency where I used to work at when I was trying to get ideas out into the world, other people's ideas, I gained this nickname from the creative directors in the company of the Dream Crusher. Because I was so risk-averse. I was so cautious about the way we'd build things. This is one of our creative directors from the agency I used to work at, Steve, having an idea, And there I am crushing it. This is his illustration that he felt compelled to do. He felt so compelled that he rendered me as a superhero or a supervillain, the Dream Crusher. And if you look closely, my clasp is the Dream Crusher clasp that crushes any dream. So people feel strongly about this, is what I'm saying. There's a lot of time and effort that goes into this. But there I am, I'm kind of risk averse. I'm very cautious about offloading a lot of these capabilities to other people, to other services, other vendors. But I'd say that, a vendor that provides a single service, such as identity, and they provide that to many, many companies, that's their core business. So if it struggles for any one of their customers, or if it struggles and it affects all of their customers, that's huge for them. They depend on its success, just as much, probably more than you do. So finding a partner that you can work with in that way, that has expertise in that field, is really valuable. Of course, it comes with things like technical and service level contracts to give you confidence and what have you, and that's fine. But this architecture also means that you can decouple your own services. You're not building them all in the same stack. You can start to think about some things that you'd outsource and some things that maybe you'd build yourselves as microservices. Again, if you're starting to use things like serverless functions for this, it gives you a much smaller surface area to kind of reason about, gives you kind of greater agility. Okay, I just have a few minutes left, so I want to kind of show you one last example, which is bringing a bunch of these things together. Webhooks and serverless functions and automation, all of these things together. And this is an example I'm going to, again, kind of jump into the browser for. And it's kind of a silly example, but at the same time, it's a practical example. This is a comments engine that I built as a static site. So there are services that you can use to add comments to your static sites, or if you don't have a comments engine yourself, things like Discuss as an API you can add. But I don't love that because it means the content of the comments lives in someone else's service away from your site. It's built effectively as a JavaScript drop-in, and I prefer the content to be in my site in this instance. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to try and show you this and talk you through it as I go. So this site here, I'm nervously putting my entire Slack channel up here, and that'll become clear why I'm doing that in a second. So this site is like a regular blog. I'll go to one of these pages. Oops, I am just going to make this a tiny bit bigger so that we can see. So there's a bunch of comments on here. These are all rendered as part of the HTML because these were generated at build time in the same way that clock was rendering the clock at build time. So what I'll do is I'll add a comment here. Hello, big, scary room of people. Add that comment. And what that's doing is that's submitting that to an API. And if I go and look over here in my backend for this, there are lots of services that will allow you to submit forms to an API. It happens that Netlify has one built in, but there are loads of others that you could use. If I go and look at the forms here, I have two forms. I've got a comments queue and an approved queue. Whoops. So the comments queue, that's what I just posted to, and there you can see my comment. When that arrives, it fires a webhook. That webhook is pointing at a serverless function, and that serverless function has one job, that's to send a notification to Slack. And that's what arrived over here. You can see my comment down here as well. I've got a couple of buttons. I can either delete that comment, we just remove it from that queue, or if I approve it, what it's going to do is it will move that, again with a serverless function, out of that queue into my other form, where it'll sit at the top of the queue. There it is. And then I'm firing another trigger, which does one thing. It runs a build. When my build runs, it brings all of the comments from the approved comments section, renders them as HTML, and deploys the site. So if I go back across to which page did I do this on? I think it was this one, the smaller one. So if I go back across here, let's see if it arrived in time. No, come on. There it is. So now it's been rendered into HTML in just a moment. I've got a comments engine that I can moderate that doesn't depend on JavaScript. It doesn't depend on content hosted externally. It's all there and encapsulated in one place, indexable by search engines or what have you. So I'm going to wrap up. Hopefully, if I go back to Keynote. Keynote. So this might seem like lots of complex plumbing, but actually each of these pieces is very discrete. 2 serverless functions, a couple of event hooks. So actually all of these things are very short, discrete pipes that means that you can have a predictable outcome to them. Got just a couple of slides left. So what is the JAMstack? This is the question that I started with. Well, JAMstack sites are rendered in advance. They're not dependent on an origin. They're progressively enhanced with JavaScript in the browser, should you need to. Do we need it? Well, I kind of think that since it brings like reduced infrastructure costs, it increases security and performance and scalability, and it kind of creates a much more confident project lifecycle, I think they're a huge boon. So I want them in my life, and I think there are lots of cases where we can use them. A bunch of links from the things I've talked about are available in these slides, including some different examples. I will be posting them right there. In fact, they're online now, so you can go to findthat.@JAMstack. Thanks very much for your time. Thanks a lot.